April 13th, Planning Commission of the Town of Chincoteague to order. I ask you all to stand for the invocation from Councilman McComb and Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, just want to thank you, Lord, for the ability to be here tonight, to live in a country where gatherings like this and meetings like this are able to take place. I ask you, Lord, to bless everybody here in this room tonight, everybody that's listening and lives on this island, Lord. Please protect our frontline workers, Lord, and all these things we pray in Jesus' heavenly name. Amen.
Amen. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I thank you all for attendance. And I don't offer at this point in time any public comment. Yeah, you'll be on the agenda. No public content, comment at this point in time. I ask for agenda review and disclosure. I would like to add to the agenda item 4A, the shore erosion concern that Mr. Talbot has brought to us. If there's no objection,
I'll make a motion to pass the agenda with the addition.
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
So moved. Thank you very much. First item on the agenda is approval of the March 9th regular meeting minutes. Are there any additions, corrections?
I move that we approve the minutes as written.
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
So moved. Thank you very much. Item number 2 is a request from Mr. Landsberg relevant to our zoning and the concept of detached quarters. I think everyone got a copy of it. I hope they did. And at this point in time, I guess, Mr. Landsberger is Chuck, both of you guys can double team us if you want.
Well, I'll start for a minute and then stuff will come on up. So, are you all familiar with, did my special use application go through here?
Yes, it did.
So you're all familiar with?
And we supported it.
Yes, what my issue was.
Yes.
So my issue is taken care of, but it seemed to me that it uncovered a fundamental flaw in the way that our zoning is. I agree entirely that we should have single-family residences, and that you shouldn't have multiple residences on one lot. But it seemed to me that making a requirement that it's all under one roof or one structure seems to be a little bit archaic, especially with the way that our world is changing today. The three main things that come to mind are, number one, adult children who have to come back, whether it's just for financial reasons or for health reasons, like with my daughter. And again, my problem's been solved, but I see it as a bigger problem than me individually. And I think something that Chuck will give you some of the figures, but I believe that 18% of kids today are living at home. And the way things are now, our town is forcing people to either make illegal modifications to their houses, or, I mean, I know of a couple of people who've modified their houses without permits inside, and they don't tell anybody, or to try and do it in a garage and not tell anybody, et cetera, et cetera. So you have children moving at home, you have people who want to age in place, but can't get help. So, for instance, one of my goals is to not have to leave Chincoteague. But unless I can hire someone who can be with me at a certain age, I can't do that. And there's no housing, as you know, here full-time that's very affordable, where you can rent someone like a nurse's aide or something, a place to live. So if someone could build a secondary structure, they would have that. And so there are all these reasons to have a secondary dwelling. And a lot of people have secondary dwellings within their same building, okay? As long, to me, what we should protect against is having multiple families living on one lot. As long as it's one family, one 9/11 dress, one, you can make any requirement you want, but that it can't be rented out, it can never be more than one person, it can't be an Airbnb, it can't be an apartment that you rent to a friend. It's either family and or a caregiver. And I think that it's something that we should look at, and I feel strongly enough about it to have teamed up with Chuck and spent some time and some effort, so I'm gonna leave it to him to give the presentation.
Good evening. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chuck Ward, and I've been retained by Mr. Landsberg to present this to you. This concept is about detached quarters, and I want to present you some information to consider in your review of this, because what we're trying to secure from the Planning Commission is a favorable recommendation to the Mayor and Council. We're looking for your support, we're looking for your opinions and your comments, but ultimately we're looking for a recommendation to the Mayor and Council.
Chuck, that's not a PowerPoint, so that's not gonna work. I'm on PowerPoint.
So I have to scroll up.
I'll scroll.
Okay, now I'll just say next slide. How about that?
There you go. That'll
Okay,
work.
great. Thank you. Prior to the 1920s, single-family dwellings were not developed the same way as they are today. Multiple structures incorporated a home's design, all for varying degrees of occupancy. Guest homes, for example, were quite customary across the countryside. These structures provided housing for visiting guests and provided some privacy for those guests during their visit. Next slide, please. We've all seen or heard of summer kitchens. I know we had a few around the farm in Stockton there. These detached structures were critical to reducing excess heat in the principal structure during the summer months. In addition to eliminating the excess heat, these structures also served as fire safety measures, because in the event that you were cooking with a cook stove and you caught fire in the kitchen, you didn't burn down the entire house. This was an important part of residential development prior to the 1920s and 30s. Next slide. The rural landscape was also dotted with servants' quarters where domestic employees would reside during off hours. The safety and security of having caregivers and domestic help close at hand was critical to allowing property owners and aging homeowners to remain in their homes. While many might think of this whole aging in place concept as a modern catchphrase, there were no other options a century ago. Servants' quarters played a large role in allowing these aging homeowners to maintain a good quality of life. Next slide. So what happened? Well, you happened. Zoning laws happened. Planning commissions happened. We created all these regulations, and as a land use planner, I'm firmly in favor of that. I love it, and I think it's great that we have good zoning laws. And the reason we have these zoning laws happen in 1926, I'm sure you're all familiar, the village of Euclid, Ohio in 1926 said, hey, we got to slow things down here. We got an apartment complex in the middle of this nice residential neighborhood. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it created Euclidean zoning, which is what Chincoteague adopts, and most municipalities across the country have adopted. And it prevents incompatible land uses from occurring in a neighborhood or in a zone. And it became, the zoning laws came from this Euclidean concept. The Euclid case was designed to protect residential neighborhoods, and from this case we derived a lot of the terminology that we use when we talk about zoning and planning today, like principal structure and single-family residential. Next slide. Well, that Supreme Court case brought about a lot of great land use control concepts. It wasn't originally designed to prevent detached living spaces from being used on a property. As zoning laws became more rigid, however, and building codes became more rigid, the concept of a home being a single structural unit became more widely accepted. Aging in place requires caregivers. Mr. Landsberger mentioned aging in place. These caregivers, whether they're family or paid employees, they need to live close by. You know, you can't have someone giving care to an elderly loved one, you know, who lives in Snow Hill and drives to Chincoteague every day. There's times in the middle of the night someone may need some help. It needs to be close by. These caregivers and family members that you may be helping need to be close by in order to make this work. And as Mr. Landsberger mentioned, the availability and expense of affordable housing limits the ability of most island residents to provide this for their domestic employees. A well-written detached quarters ordinance like has been presented to you would help solve that problem. Chincoteague's median age is increasing, as I'm sure you all know, and the need for in-home care and support is going to increase proportionately. Next slide. And feel free to stop me if I'm going too fast or got any questions about anything. While aging in place is an important issue, there are other factors to consider. According to the U.S. Census, as Mr. Landsberger also mentioned, 18% of adults between 25 and 34 years old in 2019 lived with their parents. It's 18% of that age bracket was living at home with their parents. Many of these come home due to marital issues, employment issues, financial crises, and most recently, of course, COVID pandemic created some of that to happen. As these adults return home, sometimes with spouse and children with them, we need to consider these changing family needs. And projections indicate that this return to home status and this trend that you see on that chart there is going to continue to rise. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at one obstacle that we have in our current zoning code. It's a definition. The zoning code refers to a dwelling unit as a single unit. This is the foundation, the basis by which your zoning administrator has to make his decisions. When it says it's a single unit, it's a single unit. So you have this one principal structure that you consider to be the dwelling unit on a piece of property. This exclusionary zoning regulation was implemented to prevent multiple dwellings from existing on one property. It was a way to keep the population densities within expected and calculated ranges. Zoning regulations usually get written and adopted by large municipalities, the people with the money. They've got the attorneys, they've got the people. They draft these legislations, they put them into law, and then smaller municipalities often just copy those and they borrow language from those municipalities, which is great. It happens all the time in zoning, and that's what's happened here as well. There's nothing wrong with that. It's great that we can do that, and it happens all the time. However, this proposed ordinance was written specifically with Chincoteague in mind. Other Virginia municipalities have adopted similar codes. The term we use that we're proposing here is detached quarters. You'll often hear accessory dwelling units, mother-in-law suites, even granny flats. You'll hear that one thrown around too. Virginia municipalities, including Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, they've all adopted similar ordinances to this in certain residential districts. And while these current regulations were well-intentioned and they were absolutely enacted for the good of the community, what have been the impacts of these legislations? Next slide. The impacts are on family living arrangements. We all know that these granny flats and other separate living spaces are created on the interior of existing homes or garages. It happens a lot. They're probably in your neighborhood. You might know of some people that have them. A property owner is likely to design and create these spaces without a building permit because the property owner doesn't want to draw attention to what they're doing. That's understood because they're trying to look out for the safety and the security of their family and their loved ones. The owner doesn't want to raise any concern, so he doesn't seek out a building permit. He may even try to hide those living arrangements from the neighbors to prevent being reported. The intent of the property owner is good. They want to do the right thing for their family. We all want to do what's right for our family and our loved ones. They just want to provide safe and livable space for a loved one. However, if life safety codes and building codes are ignored, these modifications may create a dangerous situation for emergency ingress and egress, or it could create an electrical issue where the service capacity of that electrical panel in that house is exceeded and we create an electrical fire. And then we've got the issues of ingress and egress in a fire, we've got electrical issues. So there's a lot of issues when people do these things because they're trying to get around the law, so to speak. They're presenting a danger and they may not even know it when they do that. Next slide, please. Please don't look at these and try to guess where they are. They're not on Chincoteague, I promise you that. But I want to use them as an example. These are impacts created by the whole single unit restriction in the current code. A lot of these unnecessary additions are added onto existing structures because as the code currently requires all living spaces to be within that single unit, excessive additions are often constructed to allow for future interior modifications. We're all familiar with the Eastern Shore style of that house there on the left, It's a typical Eastern Shore front of a house and you can see what happened. They added on the front of it. This was likely done because there was a future plan, once that addition got made, to cut that off, have a little mother-in-law suite in there or an apartment space. And that wasn't planned for, likely, when that building permit was issued. This practice leads often to historic structures, important architectural features in the town, being altered beyond recognition. And it also puts the property owner at greater risk. If you have a 2,000 square foot house and you add 1,000 square feet onto it to move in a mother-in-law or a loved one or a family member that needs your help, and there's a fire in your house, you can lose 3,000 square feet. The proposal is to allow detached quarters, which is basically just an extension of your living space, only there's a separation of the two units. They're not all under one roof. And this could just prevent a total loss of a property in the event of a fire if you can detach those spaces. So let's go to the next slide. The most important thing here is how can the community benefit from this? You know, are we looking at benefiting just the person with that house that wants to take care of their family member? I don't think so. The all communities are strengthened by long-term residents. The longer people are in a neighborhood, the more relationships they get, the more involved they get with the community, the more people volunteer to be on planning commissions and boards of zoning appeals, and they get involved in their community. The detached quarters as proposed would decrease the rate of turnover of resident families, which in turn strengthens these relationships and improves the quality of life for residents. Detached quarters also would increase affordable housing. It would create a wider range of housing options, and it would enable seniors to stay in place longer as they age and facilitate better use of the existing housing stock that we have. And we all know there's not a whole lot of extra places to build houses on Shingatig, so we need to start looking at ways to utilize the housing stocks that we have. With 79 million adults in the U.S. in 2019 lived in shared households. Shared households is defined by the U.S. Census as adults over 18 years old sharing space that aren't married or have a relationship together. For example, an uncle moves in with you, a grandmother. These are shared households. There were 79 million people in the U.S. living in shared households. So it's obvious these needs are changing. Many full-time residents here on Shingatig moved here originally overjoyed and looking forward to retirement here, only to find out later on, mobility issues or other medical needs forced them to relocate to more manageable living arrangements. We've all had friends move away from here who had to move away because of medical reasons or a sick family member. They had to go take care of them. By implementing a well-designed detached quarters ordinance into the current zoning code, the town would promote long-term residency, increase property values, and improve the quality of life for its residents. Next slide, please. I've highlighted a couple key points of the draft ordinance that you were provided tonight. The draft ordinance was designed to provide regulatory control for the design, siting, and use of these detached quarters. Currently, anyone who wants to legally create detached living space must submit a special use permit application, come to the Planning Commission, go to the Mayor and Council. This process is cumbersome, it's expensive, and there's no guidelines established to evaluate a request. There's nothing established in writing to say if someone wants to do this, how should it look? How big should it be? How should they access it? What should be done to construct this thing so that it looks like the other house? None of these things are covered. So it's kind of a cumbersome roll of the dice for an applicant to come in here asking for something that there's no guidelines to evaluate. The proposed ordinance creates a standardized and regulated process for detached living spaces to be implemented in a safe and community-friendly manner. These detached quarters are proposed to be included as a use by right. Again, we're talking about this cumbersome process, trying to eliminate some of this cumbersome process. You can eliminate the process if you create standards and guidelines for it to work well. These detached quarters would serve as additional dwelling space for family and caregivers or domestic employees of the resident. What we've proposed would create a visual and architectural complement to an existing home. These structures would be accessory. They would be half the size or less of the principal structure, and they should only be located on lots of sufficient size to support such a use. We don't propose these as rental units at all, not at all. These are extensions of the living space of the primary structure on a property. They should be considered an extension of the home's living space, just detached from the residential structure. Residential codes, including setbacks and size, would be restricted to prevent overdevelopment. Health department reviews and approvals obviously would be required to ensure adequate septic disposal. It's also suggested that these units should not have their own septic system because the house, the principal structure, would contain also this detached quarters. So it all gets calculated into as if it was one house. And that, as Mr. Landsberger mentioned, no way would another 911 address be applied to a detached quarters because essentially you'd have a living room that sits 10 feet away from your back door. It's just another room of your house, so it wouldn't have its own 911 address. There's some other specifics in there you can look through. I don't want to belabor the point by going through all of them. So let's go to the next slide. I would like to thank you for your time and consideration. The proposed ordinance, I believe, would add value to the community. This isn't really a major change. It's really just a set of guidelines to allow a safe and systematic approach to addressing a real-life need that we all recognize and we can easily understand. Regulations must reflect current and forecasted trends and should be revised accordingly. I strongly believe that the adoption of such an ordinance would have a positive effect on the residents, the neighborhoods, and it would improve the livability and quality of life in an already wonderful community. Next slide. If you have any questions for Mr. Landsberg or me, if you have any details, anything about the thought process or anything about the ordinance that we presented, we'd be happy to address your concerns. Thank you for your time.
Stay there, Chuck. Commissioners, open floor. Tom?
I do have a question.
Sure.
What's the rationale for not allowing a separate septic?
The concept here would be if you attached it, in my mind, from a land use perspective, in the future, you know, we're all gone. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now, somebody looks at this and says, well, this is essentially a standalone unit. It's a little house and it has its own septic system. Let's subdivide it. Well, that takes away from the entire concept of what we're proposing, is that little cottage, that little guest quarter, that little mother-in-law suite that you built in the backyard is designed for pedestrian access into your house and not have its own anything. It wouldn't have its own water meter because the water that's provided to your home, if you had added 1,000 square feet onto your house, you would be using that amount of water anyway by having someone else living with you. That water line would just then be teed off to the, to the cottage or to the detached quarters. It seems to me that anything that we can do to prevent it from, if it looks like a separate house and it smells like a separate house, somebody's going to think it's a separate house. And we don't want this thing to look that way at all. We want it to look very complementary. That first slide that I showed of the guest house, you know, they were built to complement the existing home. It's like, hey, here's our big, beautiful home, and here's this little house where our guests stay, or here's this little house where our servants stay. It seems to me that we don't want it to look like a separate house, so have its utilities as much as possible tied into the principal structure.
The only thing that you can't control by ordinance is the electric.
Correct.
If the electric company puts the electric, so I built another structure, as you all know. I didn't have a choice. It's the same septic, it's the same water, but I didn't have a choice with electric, because the electric company does what the electric company does.
And it may very well be because of fire safety issues, you know, like life safety issues. If the electric company, if A&N says you need a separate electrical service for this building, hey, that's fine. I don't want any electrical problems. I don't want a house burning down. So we'll let the professionals decide how the electric works. But it seems to me that by having these units to be, they're attached to the house by family, they're attached to the house by use, they're attached to the house by style and by intent, but they're not attached to the house with a 2x4 nail to it.
So I guess my question would be, if we didn't do additional septics, everybody's rated for a 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, whatever septic that you have.
Right.
And most structures are built to whatever septic that they're approved for. How would you be able to accommodate the mother-in-law suite or whatever you want to call it?
Right.
Because you wouldn't have the septic capacity.
Well, I think you need to look at that twofold, but let's look at it from the other angle.
Mm-hmm.
Will we always need septic?
Well, you
We-
raised the
we-
issue 20,
yeah.
30 years from now,
Right,
what would be
right,
the
20
challenge?
Yeah, 20 years from now, we could, I mean,
At
there
some-
could be a central sewer system there at some point. I believe that if you went to the health department, perhaps there's a way of, let's say that the drain field is rated for 3-bedroom, but the system itself would be rated for more.
Mhm.
Let's say perhaps, you know, that the health department and an engineer comes up with a design where you add another run on your drain field, or you add another cell to some of these septic treatment systems are celled, and you could add another cell to increase the capacity. There may be ways to work that out, but I don't want to get into what the health department does and how they work. It just, this is more about the land use, and then figuring out those details. We don't want to pass off any of this onto the health department right now. I think we want to look at this from a land use perspective and what we want the town to look like.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's what kind of bothered me a little bit about that statement. Is like, say for example, someone did just what you said, and they put out a big chunk of money, and 3 years later, after they put in a new septic system, they have this need. And because part of the reason for going through and doing the detached dwelling is that it's probably less expensive than modifying the original structure, and a whole lot easier and nicer. But, you know, then you have this big cost constraint because of the septic. And also, it seems like we rely on septic to go through and do to do a lot of the regulations for us. That should be done in another way. And that at times can be counterproductive, especially if we do go through and consider something like centralized sewer at some point. You know, what do you do then? You know, that was in fact, I thought the proposal was extremely well written. And I did go through and balance it against the comp plan, and I thought, geez, you know, this is a whole lot better than what we got in the comp plan. And so I thought it was great. The only other concern I had was in item 2. How are you, especially sub-item 3, where there's a caregiver providing services to the occupants. I mean, is that like they, shovel snow or sweep the sidewalks once or twice a year, or,
Right.
you know, how, it almost seems like there needs to be some sort of measurable metric there.
I think that's a wonderful point to make. I think you have to have, there's a purpose and an intent in every code. And the purpose clause, I think would be a great place to define that. The purpose of this is to allow for full-time domestic help who are providing healthcare services, and perhaps it's not just healthcare. Perhaps it's, God forbid one of us were to go blind, and we need someone to drive us around and help us around. Maybe we would want to hire someone to live there with us, to drive us to the store or take us places. It may not always be specifically related to a disabling medical condition. It may be related to a need for someone to do things for them. I think you're correct. I mean, if you just said services, I think you bring up a valid point. That's something the Planning Commission should certainly consider adding to it. I'm not against, and I'm not going to stand here and say that I'm against adding more to this, because anything this commit, you see this stuff every month. You see things happening every month, and you pay attention to this. And if there's things you feel like you need to add to this, then it's certainly this is the canvas that you start with.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
After the need exists, what do you do as far as enforcement?
What I believe would happen, based on the studies that I've read and the realtor that I just spoke with on my way here tonight, I don't believe you're ever going to see that use go away, because the law says, if the draft ordinance says, that it has to be resided in by a family member or a caregiver or a domestic employee. So right off the bat, somebody's not going to go, oh, I want to go by Mr. Britton's house because he's got a detached quarters back there, I could rent that out. Well, they know right off the bat that's illegal, they can't do that. However, if there's somebody coming to Shingatig to look to buy a piece of property, and they expect or maybe plan for or just guessing that someday they may need someone to be near them to help them, or they have a daughter they may want to move back with them, they will see that property, I'm picking on you, they'll see Mr. Britton's property with the detached quarters on the back, and it will be prime real estate, because that's what they're looking for. I just spoke to a realtor who bought a home for that reason, because there was a detached quarters on that property, and it looked like the perfect thing to do, because there's a spot where the mother-in-law can live, or the grandparent can come back and stay when they need help. So I don't think you're going to see, I don't want to see this as a, Board of Zoning Appeals does that. Board of Zoning Appeals easily, we've done it before, it's easy to say, sure, you can put that handicap ramp in the setback, but when you don't need it anymore, take it away. So I don't think that I don't think that there's a problem of the use. I don't think we should consider the use being taken away, because it should be used by right.
Just want to point out two more things. First of all, this pandemic has taught us anything. It should have taught us something about it. It certainly taught me something about living, the living space. Okay. I guess you're all fortunate you don't have a daughter or a son or a mother who is immune compromised. Okay. We may have another pandemic. This is this may not be the first one. What it proved to me is that I need to have some kind of facility to take care of my daughter. She was here for 3.5 months, okay? And we need to make that acceptable. The other thing is, if you go back in time, if you drive around this area and you see all the farmhouses where there's a house with an addition, and an addition, and an addition, that's what they were doing, okay? So we're just making that a little bit more practical and a little bit more feasible. But it all has to be within in the proper building codes, et cetera, the way I did mine.
I think it'd be interesting too, for some of these other municipalities that have approved such or such changes, is to find out how they determine what a family is, and then how that is proven. So it doesn't become second cousin Harry or, third cousin Sally, that needs a place to stay. It would truly be immediate family.
Some of the codes that I reviewed actually spell out, aunt, uncle, they actually spell out
And that's probably
family
even a little bit too broad,
relationships.
because that's not truly immediate family.
Right.
Well, I thought about that, because like in the comp plan, it says that the owner has to live in the house. And at first, I thought that was pretty good. But then going through and thinking about it, say for example, someone owns the property and they rent it out to someone who needs a caregiver.
Right.
And they're not, no one involved is a relation.
I think if
Is
you'll
that
notice-
still valid? And I think it is.
I think throughout most, and I had this intent when I wrote it, and forgive me if I may have some misleading words in there, but the original intent was the resident of the principal structure. In other words, in your case, a long-term tenant has been renting a house for, years, and they want to stay in that house because they're accustomed to it. That the property owner would then, of course, have the right to, in this case, would have the right to apply to build that detached quarters, so that the family member, or that the renter could have a family member or caregiver stay there with them. I think that you start stepping on some Federal Fair Housing Act laws when you decide to create a law that applies to owner-occupied versus rental-occupied, because it's very difficult to apply rules to a house based on who's living in it. Federal Fair Housing Act wouldn't appreciate, telling someone, oh, you can't do this because you're a renter. It's not legal. I'm not an attorney, obviously, but I don't think that would pan out very well.
Just for discussion purposes too, though, one of the comments you made was building design complement the existing structure.
Absolutely.
We do not have a building design requirement in our comprehensive plan or in our
And
zoning.
we should, right, Mr. Rosemary?
Well, we spoke of it before, but there was a lot of reluctance to that degree.
I understand.
That we shot down pretty
Right.
quick. So, whether that would be a sales item or not, I don't know. But at this point in time, I'm just raising this now because we will go into discussion on this
Certainly.
issue.
Well,
I think the
that-
points are well taken. I'll speak for myself. I come in here tonight with a cane. I have an oxygen tank in the car.
Bless your heart.
I have a daughter, God bless her, who comes down once a month just to make sure that the two of us are doing well. We're moving towards that phase that David spoke of. But the reality of it is, again, that the configuration that my house is, I can accommodate it. So my biggest fear is enforcement, okay? What it does to the neighborhood, and even in a rental situation. There are rental situations on this island where a family rents a couple, maybe two children, and come Saturday and Sunday, there's 33 cars in the driveway. Now, they're the issues that have plagued us in the past. Parking, the impact on the neighborhood, and the reality of a neighborhood conglomeration like we have in this island that has, you name it, it's like a mixing bowl. You have a trailer next to a $500,000 house,
Correct.
And,
And I think that what you would find is, as you allow uses like this where long-term residents can stay on the island longer versus leaving off the island to go somewhere where they may need care. I think what you may find is that uses like this would allow residents to stay longer in their home rather than giving it up for a weekly rental. And you create tighter community, relationships where, the neighbor may say, wow, I think I want to stay here because if I leave, somebody's going to buy this and turn it into a summer vacation rental. That's going to ruin, poor Ray's, weekends. I think that this is not design. I don't think by design this in any way would increase the tourist rental home thing. I know that's difficult to enforce. It doesn't. They don't create communities. They don't create neighborhoods. It creates different people next to your house every week. This would create a situation where a family member in need, or a caregiver could come to live on your property with you, and then you can stay there longer. I think it would make a longer residential use.
Any other commissioners, any questions or concerns?
And please also consider in your discussions, realize that when you mentioned about you don't have architectural guidelines. You don't. But in something like this, you could start dabbling in that world to say that if you're going to construct a detached quarters, then you could have standards in there that say it must be of similar architectural design with similar architectural features and materials, exterior materials. You can start working on that language a little bit. This could be your first experiment with having some architectural guidelines. Because if this law were to be enacted, it's going to be enacted based on the input of the Planning Commission and the Mayor and Council and the public. So this may be a chance to start dabbling in that a little bit. So consider that too.
David, thank you so much. Thanks again for all you do for this town.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chuck. Okay. Item number 2, detached, item number 3, the drainage ordinance discussion. The ordinance committee presented us with a request. I guess, Mr. Talbot, do you want to take on this,
Yes, I will.
just to give us a brief where we're at, where we're going, or where we'd like to go?
The ordinance committee, I'll pull this off while I'm up here.
Yeah, good.
The ordinance committee at its March meeting was concerned, as you all know, we had a lot of rain over the winter, and we had resulting in a lot of drainage issues. The ordinance committee wanted to take a look at the ordinances that we have that provide for drainage of individual lots with an eye towards improving them so that some of these issues go away. I think everybody here has lived here long enough to understand that main problem is someone's lot is filled higher than someone else's, than the neighbor's lot, and the neighbor complains that they get water from the person that just filled up their lot. Well, that's absolutely true at times, but it's also true that the neighbor who's complaining may have been there for 50 years running water on the lot next door, which is 1.5 feet lower, and filled that lot with water for 50 years. Now that person wants to enjoy their property, which they have the right to, and has put some fill on it, and the water's coming back, and now the shoe's on the other foot. So the problem is, it's an issue.
Mhm.
It's a real issue. It becomes a matter of the chicken and egg syndrome. Who was here first and who has the right to do this or that. So what I told the council was that Mr. Rosenberg was here at the council meeting at the time. I would like to see the planning commission take up this issue and present some viable solutions. Mark and I have discussed it quite a bit, and we have searched high and low, up and down, and sideways for sample ordinances which could contribute to an eventual ordinance for the town of Chincoteague, and we found some probably decent bits and pieces, but nothing comprehensive that is pointed right at our problem as a solution. And in my speaking with other officials, Mark, who knows a lot more officials in this world than I do, is speaking to them, apparently this is a widespread problem that no one has really solved yet. We were just discussing it before the meeting. If there is a solution out there and we could find, we would certainly present it and tailor it to our own needs. Mr. should not be.
Yeah, actually, people have, the problem isn't unique to Chincoteague.
No.
And actually, people have been working it. But of course, it is a complex problem. And it's not a problem just on one lot owner. It's basically, you have to treat it as a system. So you have to look at the lots around that one lot. There's actually a tool out there called Land Image Analyst. And what it does is it takes the land elevation data and predicts the water flows. You mark off a chunk and it predicts the water flows through
There's
that.
actually quite a number of engineering programs that do this.
Yeah.
And the key word there is engineering programs.
Yeah.
They don't make them for builders and homeowners, and
Uh,
they make them for people.
Well, that's why I bring up the Land Image Analyst. It's a free download, and I've downloaded myself and played with it. The problem is you can't expect your typical homeowner to
Exactly.
go through and do it. But that particular application was built for communities, for use communities around the bay. And so there may be communities that are developing ordinances that utilize that.
And there are a lot of ordinances out there. I think most of you know, we have some builders here and everything. If you exceed, if you disturb more than 10,000 square feet, you have to get a land use permit from the county. And that's their threshold, 10,000 square feet. And once you reach 10,000 square feet, the regulations that you'll have to abide by are fairly onerous if you've ever done it. You're going to be hiring an engineer, you're going to be spending a lot of money to have a soil erosion plan designed, the drainage on your lot designed. When you get into very much more complicated issues than that, he's going to apply some of these engineering programs which do all this for you and require some calculations. If you saw briefly in the paperwork that I presented to the ordinance
Right.
committee, I presented what I found to be the simplest one that I could find after searching for several hours for a single lot, which happened to be in the state of California. From my training, I understand how they got there and what they're doing. I don't see that happening and being able to be applied equally and quickly without hiring some professionals to get it done. Which is what we're trying to do here, is write an ordinance that can be applied evenly throughout the town by just about anyone who can look at it and understand it and say, yes, this is what I need to do. It's going to have to be, I mean, when we start talking about the square footage of permeable surfaces, the square footage of impermeable substances, you have to be able to calculate the quantity of runoff, the velocity of the runoff. You have to be able to calculate the amount of storage you need for all this. These are all things that the engineers want to do for you when he goes out and design your plan. It sounds fairly straightforward, and the concept is very straightforward. It's just in practice difficult to do, and to apply to each individual homeowner or in a system. And the bigger the system you get, the more complicated this gets when you start talking about collection nodes and things like that.
Well, that's really, I think, maybe I'm putting the horse before the cart, or after the cart, but Clark Nixon did a study for us some years ago,
And they're
Yes.
experts in this.
and they were good. It's a good study, but it looks at a large picture, the big picture. And it looks at primarily the distribution of our water by the town, administered by the town, so to speak. Ditches, culverts, and those kinds of things. The fallacy in the past that we've encountered here, and we've been dealing with this 15, 16 more years, whatever, is that 10,000 square feet
Right.
has always been a roadblock. If we ignore that requirement, or that as our parameter, and bring it down to a need basis, basically small lot application, you know, I think then if you focus on where does the water go from any given property that exists today, and where will it go to any land disturbance on those existing properties. And I gave a case to to Mark of, we experience here on the island a lot of weekend development, weekend construction activity that may or may not be observed by our local officials. But we have the ability through mapping to identify, once they are identified where these projects take place, to see who, what, when, and where it takes place. You know, a lot of it requires a neighbor diming on somebody, if you will, or making a report, but that may be necessary. But your initial thrust at the ordinance committee, I think what we need to do is talk in the most simplified terms to begin with, and then raise it to the elevation where it's applicable, where we can actually enforce it. Part of it's going to be enforcement. Part of it's going to be you cannot bring a truck on this island until you have a permit, and people are not going to like that.
Well, again, and you're correct. It needs to be straightforward and simple. I would say the problem we're trying to solve, and a drainage system for the island, and there are several systems that make up the entire system, several subsystems, is complicated. What we're trying to accomplish here, or what I was directed to do by the council, was to propose a fill ordinance that allows someone to get a permit and fill their property legally, and when they get done filling it, it's not a nuisance to their neighbor, which is kind of what the direction they pointed me in. And this points the whole problem down to a solution for an individual homeowner or developer who wants to build one house, or someone who wants to construct a home. And I have a lot that I want to improve on. First thing most people do is call the truck and start filling. There needs to be some rules that we go by in order to fill that, so that you don't make a problem for your neighbors. I found this very simple statements on the board now. In one of the ordinances, it is in the preface to an ordinance. It basically says, well, I'll read it. No building shall be erected on any land, and no change shall be made in any existing contours of any land, including any change in the course, width, or elevation of any natural or other drainage channel in any manner that will obstruct, interfere with, or substantially change the drainage from such land to the detriment of the neighboring lands. Factors to be considered in determining substantial change shall include existing zoning, recommendations of the adopted comprehensive plan, and adopted drainage standards of the Virginia Highway Commission. And is it administration of the requirement, the zoning administrator shall refer to the application submitted to him, to the county engineer, which we don't have, but we can certainly do later. In other words, if you want to improve a piece of property, basically the water coming from your property has to be dealt with on your property before it runs off onto someone else's. It's that simple. And I'd like to go through, because we have some things in place right now in the existing ordinance, nuisance ordinance, which are very helpful, but they're not enforceable. And on April 11th of 19, the ordinance committee voted on this passage: the filling or placing or permitting of the filling or placing or allowing to remain or the maintaining of any material or substance, whether man-made or natural, on any property which may impede, obstruct, block, or adversely affect an adjoining property, and is determined that the placing of fill or substance has affected the adjoining property, then a ditch, swale, or other approved method must be installed to prevent such property from gaining water from the adjoining neighbor's actions. This was added on to the existing nuisance ordinance. We already have a nuisance ordinance which does not allow you to, and it's been in the code for many years, does not allow you to fill any ditch, swale, or an existing drainage structure. This was added basically to say that you can't do anything that causes water to run off from your neighbor. This is exactly what we need. The problem is this is not enforceable. We can't enforce this. Mark can't go out and say, somebody, you violated this. Many times filling is done with no permit. We don't know. You can put 100 loads of fill on your property, and if you're not disturbing more than 10,000 square feet, you fall under nobody's jurisdiction, not the towns, not the counties. So, and we've all seen individual lots filled up what seem to be waist high. So I think there are a couple basic things that we need. First, we need a threshold for a permit. We need to have a permitting process, and we need to have a threshold for that permit. We've kicked around all kinds of things. Is it 10 loads of fill? Is it 1 load of fill? And I say loads, it'll be cubic yards because that's what it's counted in. Is it a number of square feet? And as Mark aptly pointed out right before we started the meeting here, you can take a 2,000 square foot lot and put 100 loads on it and fill it all the way up, so that really doesn't make a lot of sense. So, different things we have to talk about, but, we need to have a permitting process. Otherwise, the town has no business on somebody's property telling them you can't do that. We have no right to go there. We have no ordinance to help us enforce it. And we need to have a threshold, identify a threshold for that. Once we require a permit and identify a threshold, then we have to offer some solutions. And in this world, they're called best management practices, BMPs. BMPs are basically structures, swales, drains, drop inlets, that sort of thing. There are many different styles of them, but we have to offer them some solutions. These are acceptable ways to deal with the problem. And as planning commission, I see your problem as
Coming up.
setting all these levels to where they're not onerous and where they're still workable. I mean, I'm sure David doesn't want to have to go out in the next couple of weeks and start construction on the lot, and all of a sudden he can't start because he can't fill the lot to start with. It's a difficult thing to do. So that's your
Charge.
yes, your charge. Mark and I are here we are continuing to look for sample ordinances that we can pick and choose from. That would help us along.
Does the county have a storm management plan?
Yes, a very comprehensive storm management plan.
Has the town looked into any of those pieces from the standpoint of Public Works, looking at that, or?
Yes, and I actually spoke to Mr. Governor, who is in charge of administering that plan for the county, and about this very thing. I told him, I said, Chris, this is what I'm trying to do. Mr. Governor is an engineer. And I said, this is what we're trying to do, Chris. He said, good luck.
Yeah.
He said, all my comrades, he said, are looking for similar things. He said, no one's really come up with anything really good yet.
Yeah.
The stormwater solution has been in place for quite a while on a large scale. But when you get down to individual lots and property rights, and somebody's going to want to sue somebody over it's a taking of my property, which I believe was an issue when the planning commission addressed this before.
Yeah.
That's the issue. That's the problem as I see it, as I was assigned by the council. Mark and I are here to help you with whatever you need as the staff, and we will certainly get you whatever you want, and we will try to find more samples of people who have done it correctly.
Any of the commissioners have anything, comments? My biggest concern, not concern, if we're going to require building permits for construction purposes, why is it so difficult, or why have we made it difficult to add that requirement that the property itself has to be reviewed to ensure that that building impact will not impact other folks?
And you're right, it would seem it would go hand in hand. I would suspect that part of the issue is if we adopt an ordinance like this, we're adopting something that the county doesn't have. Now, the county, Mark was a building administrator for the
Right.
county.
Yeah.
They administer the same building code as we have. Sometimes they argue whether it's interpreted the same, but they administer the same building code that the town of Chincoteague has. It's a state building code. And the county has a very comprehensive, as we said, a very comprehensive soil and erosion plan. However, if we adopt a local ordinance like this, we're going to do something the county hasn't done and doesn't do. So that it may be looked upon as like we're being a little more onerous than our parents are, so to speak.
But I see no reason why not to.
I don't either.
I'm not, as far as I'm concerned, if they feel it's a challenge, then let them voice their concerns and.
I can tell you, in a former life, I was on the other side of this, and I would be sitting out here saying, don't you dare do this.
I know.
Don't you dare.
Some years ago,
But it is, the problem is pervasive enough that if it deserves a solution. And all it takes is going to take some work to do, but it deserves a solution. And the solution should be, in my opinion, and I think the council would agree, common sense, simple enough to apply, that it's easily understood, and it's not so onerous that that everything stops,
Right.
which we've all seen that before with regulations that build laws.
And I think in new construction, it's easier to get compliance because you've got a vacant lot, and you can put wells in, you can
Yeah.
build to it. The big problems is with your existing lots with homes in it that are filling, that are causing runoff issues too.
the example I just gave it for the other
Correct.
week was an existing property that had been there for years and years and years. And suddenly you have
New
2.5 to
upgrades
3
built
feet
to
of sand.
And if,
Did that property have a house already on it?
Yes.
now, if there's and Mark, you correct me if I'm wrong, this just crossed my mind, but if we do require a permit in order to put a certain amount of fill on your property, at that time, doesn't our flood ordinance state that you cannot fill up higher on the outside of your foundation than in your crawl space?
Right, you want to be careful you fill a flood zone because you could have a sub-crawl space,
Subgrade crawl space is
sub-grade
FEMA
crawl
policy.
space on your.
When we built our home, we had to marry the inside to the outside,
Exactly.
essentially, so it was even.
I can tell you in my other world, I see that constantly.
Yeah.
It is not unusual at all to open up a crawl space and it be 6, 8, 10, 12 inches lower than the outside grade because people are trying to fill up around it. And FEMA considers that a subgrade crawl space, and they don't look favorably on your flood insurance rates when you do that.
A quick question. Addressing individual lots, and we can talk about this as we discuss. One of the access points we use now is ditches, swales, and what have you, ravines, whatever. But we do have existing stormwater systems that might be accessible from a private landowner. Because we attach our water system going in, we can attach drain water going out is
And
my
in most
concept.
municipalities, as you know, if you can get the water from in fact, it's recommended
In-
and written by ordinance, you can
Yes.
get the water from your property to the street where the collection system exists.
Right,
And that actually is an issue in many municipalities. They will only let you, if you go in and improve a lot, and they make you, and this is where the engineer comes in, he will calculate the drainage from that lot to the municipal system before you start. And his mandate is, the law tells him that when he gets done developing, he cannot release water into the system any faster than it did before you started
right,
developing.
right.
And if you're having more runoff, then he has to build in storage on that property
Mhm.
so that, and based on, I think, a 10-year storm.
10-year flood storm.
So that the water does not flow to the collection system any faster because you'll overload the municipal system. So that is a requirement in most soil erosion programs that I've seen. I have done some commercial projects where we actually had to install underground tanks to store up to 50,000 gallons of
And then
water.
bleed it off over time?
And it was, we had a system of valves
Yeah,
and
pumps
orifices
and-
where
yeah.
they discharged into the city water system at a certain rate because that's all the city would let us have, and that was back in mid-80s.
Well, coming from Philadelphia, Philadelphia has a municipal water system that it's tied into the water system going in and the water system coming out, because it's tied into the sewage also, so.
In any event, I just wanted to show you what you do have in place. We do have some good things in place. It's just that it's very difficult for Mark to go out with a straight face and say, you have to abide by this, because there's no consequence if they don't.
Yeah.
And most of the time, you can get away with that. If we don't require a permit to fill a lot, then you can go fill a lot and do whatever you want to, and we have no knowledge of it.
No, I,
Cause you to get denied this permit. I mean, say if you got a lot that's in the middle of a bunch of high lots, and you got nowhere for your water to go, I think I'm denying you.
No, I mean, the obvious thing to do there, and I will tell you that the best thing to do, and I did it with my neighbor, the best thing to do is agree with your neighbor how to do it. If you go by my house, I have a swale which runs right center of the property line. The inverted swale is right on the property line, it's half on my neighbor, half on me, the water collects there, it goes out to the street. That is the best way to do it, but let's face it, neighbors sometimes don't get along, so.
Yeah.
And we do have flag lots that are essentially isolated, like David says, you know, you're surrounded by 4 other lots.
But, yeah, and that's part of it, what we're gonna have to develop.
Yeah,
And
easements.
there is a lot of language in some of the other ordinances that you can't build your lot no higher than your neighbor's lot, and then put in some B and Ps to direct it to a certain drainage spot. So it would be great putting a swell or something.
I think it's doable. I just, my hope is that the council will be supportive of it. I know council's given it to you to give it to us,
Right.
but in the past, we've
What?
always gotten, well, what about?
I apologize, but I suggested they give it to you.
Okay. Well, I was here, so, yeah, but, no.
But, you know, the planning commission has and you all have the knowledge of what's happening on the island, how things are put together, so, to me, it's the obvious place to, get the job done. But again, Mark and I are here to help you with whatever you need, and, we will try to present to you some sample ordinances or bits and pieces of sample ordinances that may work.
They work. Okay? Any other questions for Mike? Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Final review of the, how many times have I said that? 2020 comprehensive plan?
Well,
We are at the point where, our last meeting, we essentially gave Bob an okay on all the additions of the pictorial and to revise those pages where the pictures were being added or changed or whatever. And at this point in time, if everybody can, if we're in agreement, I'd like to get everybody's hard drives, or flash drives rather. I'd like to get all the council flash drives. I had mentioned to Mike if he could ask council if any of them have them. If they don't have them, we'll have to make enough. Bob will update them. And at this point in time, I'd like to entertain a motion that once we have all our flash drives updated and present it back to council, that we say, council, here's your finished product. I mean, the plan itself is in force now. It's just the dressing on it to finish it up. So if you're all in concurrence with that, if anybody has the flash drives, please get them back to Bob.
And now's the time to speak, because what we displayed at the last meeting were the individual chapters and changes applied to each individual chapter. Once all everybody's happy with that, then I need to go through and stitch all those chapters together, and that's the dog work. Now, I do it from the base chapters. There's a very strict configuration control and change tracking that's applied to all these files. That's why when you get the drives back, there's 1,000 files on them. And I put in the README to go through and explain what each type represents. So I go from the base file all the way up to the synthesized master, so there's no chance for error along the way. So just need to make sure that everybody's happy with all the changes that you saw the last time. There's nothing out there that we need to change, and with that, I'll go through and put it all together and make it a pretty little PDF.
I think we're good with it. Like I say, if we can get those flash drives in, we'll move on that.
And can they leave them at the front desk at the office? And
Oh, yeah, they can go
Within
up
the
at the
next
town
week.
office, or,
I'll send the council all a notification asking them to bring them to the workshop meeting with them Thursday night,
that'd be great.
and then, we'll put them at the desk on Friday, if that's all right.
Okay.
And if you folks
Yeah,
can drop
that
them
sounds
off
good.
with April or Louise, they know what they are. At least they know them before. Okay?
And, yeah, so I'll stop by like a day or so after the workshop and pick them all up.
Yeah, that should be Friday.
Sounds good.
If those who don't have, you have some extra flash drives, I think, like, If we don't have enough,
I can get some.
Okay.
I think I've handed out all the ones I
Yeah.
had, not to me when I assumed here, but yeah, I'll
quick, put it in this year's budget, not next year's budget. I mean, you're already there, I think.
We're in a good spot right on next
Yeah,
year's budget.
yes, we are. Okay, item number 4A is, I had very quickly sent everyone out a missile that Mike had sent us this morning, and relevant to the need down at the harbor. If anybody hasn't been down there, they ought to take a ride down there. God knows it's changed so much over the last 15, 20 years. We watched the house in the marsh go away, and we watched that open up. And, I guess, Mike, you need some support from the standpoint of letter to the Corps of Engineers
No,
at
and
this
if you,
point? Or-
if you would, and, where this stems from is, Representative Valoria, our, District 2 representative, has an opportunity, each representative in the House of Representatives this year has a opportunity to, request 10 different, or present 10 different projects for funding, community projects for funding,
Right.
which is the first time in quite a while that that Congress has done this. She reached out to, let's see, the county, Hancock, Chincoteague, HRSD was on the call, and ANEC was on the call as well. And last week, we had a conference call with her and her staff, and asked for projects that we might put before her to be, submit to her to be a candidate for one of these 10 projects from her district. The town of Chincoteague, we elected to submit our inlet study, which I don't know if you all know it or not, you probably do, being the planning commission, but the widening of the inlet's an issue. It was looked into by Mr. West quite some time ago. The solution seems to be, when they talk to the Army Corps of Engineers, before they recommend any solution to the problem, they want to study them, and probably to make a model so that when they start designing solutions, they can use the model for the design. So the study has to be done. The study is a 3-year study at a cost of $3 million. Half of it will be paid for by the federal government. We submitted that project to her last Wednesday, I believe, is when we had the conference call. And one of the things that they need, the project application was due April 6th. The call was April 7th. So we were under the gun to get it in.
It's always that way.
Sent it in, and her staff has reached back out to us asking us, well, we need some community support. I said, okay, like what? And, well, letters from citizens or citizen groups. Mr. Landsberger, I contacted him today. He got me a couple from the museum. I think the CCA gave me one. Evelyn at the chamber sent a letter of support, and I put that little information packet together just to have something to write the letter about. But one from the Planning Commission, which should carry a lot of weight, being the Planning Commission. So the trick here is that I've got to send them in tomorrow. So it's something I would even, if you want me to, sit down and pen myself in the morning if someone wants to apply their name to it, or tune it up and apply their name to it, and we'll put it on town stationery, whatever. The county has sent a letter in, but we've had the county's letter for a couple of years now. And just for your information, the county, if you were listening to the meeting last week, the county has escrowed $200,000 at this point. They keep putting $50,000 a year into their budget to help us with our half of the study.
Good.
And they're up to $200,000 now, which tells you how long they've been saving. And Mike Mason told me last week, he gets constant questions of, what's this $50,000 doing over here? What's this $50,000? He said, that's Chincoteague's, don't leave it alone, it's staying in there. So he's caught off the sharks for our money for a few years now.
Can the letter be a clone?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we'll change up the letterhead and a few words here and there. They're looking for support from the community. They were also looking for newspaper articles, editorial boards, which I don't know of anybody here. But in any event, all that kind of stuff would help. And we're going to put it all together. I'm going to send it. They gave me a specific email address to send it to that goes right to her, the people in her office that need it. And I need to send it by the end of the day tomorrow. so it can be included with our application, give us a little more substantial chance of being
Do
successful.
our actual signatures have to be on it, or could we submit the planning commission, IUR representatives identified?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would entertain a motion to that
I
effect.
make a motion, we do that.
That,
And I should note that the comp plan calls out as one of its objectives
Yes,
that
it
the
does.
study be performed.
And that's probably something we should mention in there, because that adds a lot of weight to
Yeah.
it. The comprehensive plan is a requirement of the state of Virginia, so that should add a lot of weight to it.
yeah.
Page 6, chapter 2.
Table of contents, right here.
Paragraph 3.
Have we heard back from VIMS relevant to the young fellow who was here last year or the year before?
Yeah, I was gonna, the doctor,
Yeah, who did you weren't here, but they actually did piling samples all around the island. And the projection that he presented to council at that time was the south end's gonna grow. The south end will continue, acetate, will continue to grow. At some point in time, it may actually exceed what we had in the old days, but of course, this is over time, you know, and we don't have time right now.
I have, if you can bear with me just a minute, I have a time-lapse video that is it's a satellite image.
The one you showed us, or you sent it to us? Because I sent it,
Did I send it to you?
yeah.
you sent it to me, and I
Okay,
sent it to
great.
everyone, I don't know whether they had
Yeah.
it, but show it to them if you would.
It's, because it starts in 1984, and it's
Yeah.
a GOES satellite, geostationary satellite, and it shoots the code, and it's really amazing.
Yeah, if you would.
I had an old timer tell me he used to ride his horse across the inlet
Yeah.
to the,
When I first came here in 1970,
That's good.
all I can remember is having to do this to get out.
Yeah.
I had a series of
Be able to
escorts.
walk across it.
Now you just, right, you're there. Yeah.
But good question on the doctor stuff, because his presentation was extremely informative, and he was supposed to.
And it was simple, it was simple.
Yeah, and I thought he
to
was supposed to
understand.
do something like in the last year. Because he was out here doing the core samples.
They actually did core samples on Halley Wilton Drive
Yeah.
and all over the island. We've been blessed last year with feast, or famine rather, as far as items coming to the
There you go.
commission. I think it's gonna increase now this year.
Last time's go book.
Yep, there it is.
Starts in 1984, that's 84, and you see it growing. We actually had to dredge the inlet several times to keep it open back in the early days. As it started growing towards Wallace, it was trying to attach.
The rapidity that happened is just scary.
And if you've been here a while, you understand that back in the 80s, the channel was actually, you had to go up into the cove a little ways to get cross into the canal. You couldn't
Oh, yeah.
go straight in like you
Yeah,
did
you had-
now, it's offshore.
Looks like ziggy-zaggy.
Yep,
Mm-hmm.
the Mark channel, that is.
Well, this ties into the town's resiliency coming up in the very near future. There's a study just been done down in North Carolina on ghost fires. And essentially, what you're experiencing on Assateague, if you go over there today, that's not all birch bark beetle. That's, a lot of that is salt intrusion. And it's coming our way.
I did send this video, and I tried to play it during our Zoom call with Gloria, and the facilitator of the meeting hadn't enabled us to share our screens. But I did send this to her. She asked me to send it to her after the fact, and I did. And they do have Gloria's office, and she has looked at it. So.
Yeah, I looked at it right away and said, son of a gun, look how fast that was, you know?
And if you look at it, and I've been looking at this for a while, and every time I look at it, I notice something else that's going away. Purchase Island's going away, gunboats opened up.
Mm-hmm.
The shoals in the middle there, you can see them back in the early 2000s, they start just
Yep.
to push to the north and they're gone. There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's the hump in the middle of the island that seems to be developing? Because that's our biggest fear, a breakthrough.
Yeah, that's, washovers get narrower and narrower. And I actually was given a picture of a satellite, a different satellite view. It's a printed picture this week. And I had the mayor look at it. Of course, he's been around here forever, been on the water forever. He thinks it's early 80s, but washover was much larger, much wider than
Wider.
that section of beach back there.
Well, they've actually created a beach now in Tom's Cove, or in that area. They have park benches and even have little barbecue things set up.
We had a beach there before. That's where
I know,
that's
but
where-
that was Little Beach. But, yeah. So you need anything more from us as far as,
No, sir.
will you be our author?
I will certainly pen that letter first thing in the morning, and I'll put it in your email.
Okay, anything else, gang? Any comments? Mr. McComb?
I'm good.
Good.
David?
Good, thank you.
Molly? Mike? I started to say, last year we had a famine come into the commission. I don't know whether this is gonna be a feasting year or not, but we're starting out a little bit busier than what we experienced last year, so. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll move we adjourn.
I have a motion, a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. So moved. Thank you so much.